really interesting today, and I'm going to read the first episode script from my podcast, Why Wars Happened. That's my podcast. My podcast is called Why Wars Happened, and I talk a lot about, obviously, the background to wars in history, and I do a lot of narrative episodes, and I have guests on for interview episodes too. And I haven't done a narrative episode for a while, but I am finishing up my interview episodes and I'm going back to narrative, so that will come soon. But for now, I thought that I would do a little massage and we can relax and start to unwind from the day. And I thought that I would read us a story about this is from my American Revolution series, and this is the first episode in that narrated series. I like to go back hundreds of years, centuries, to understand really why a war happened. Why did it happen? Okay, so we're starting in the late 1500s in England to kind of understand why England needed America and why it held on to that colony for so long. Okay, so let's start with King James the First. I love King James the First because he's just such a fascinating guy to talk about. But okay, so we're going to talk about a little bit of the world that he stepped into when he became the King of England in 1603. So back in the 1500s and pretty much everything before then, things were heated, cooked, and built with wood. Stone was definitely used in some cases, but if you weren't living in a castle or building a city wall, you basically had wood everywhere. Your house is made of wood. There was kind of some mud and maybe some animal poop in there too, but your day was generally spent toiling over the land with farming tools made out of wood, and after a long day in the field using wood and tools, you went inside to where your food was cooked using a wood fire. If your kids had toys, they were probably wood toys. If you went into town, you took your wooden wagon, and there were wooden buildings around everywhere, and you purchased items displayed on market stands made out of wood. Ships were wood, heating was from wood, and a whole lot of other stuff was made out of wood. Basically, wood was life, and life was wood, and you couldn't live without it. So, in the 1500s, the population of England was around 2 million people, and the forest covered 9% of that land. But 500 years before that, in the year 1000, the population of England was around 1.5 million, and the forest was 15% of the land, which was almost twice as much. So, within 500 years, the population had increased by 500,000, and the amount of wood available was nearly cut in half. So as you can see, the forest of England was dwindling. It was dwindling so fast. But, 500 years is a long time, so maybe that's slow to you, I don't know. It must have been like watching the ocean lose water and change over time. But, so England had things like wood and wool and food, but seeing that it was an island, England had to go elsewhere for most of the things the population needed, and they also needed to sell things that they did make to other countries. Money comes into your country, you sell things to other places. That's a nice system. That's how most countries work. You want to sell things and have money come in. But the problem was that the English needed wooden ships for this. So that took a lot of trees to make too. And being that they were an island, they couldn't really communicate with the outside world unless they used those wooden ships for that too. They needed to get messages off the island. Well, they would have to use wooden ships. And on top of that, wars were constant. And England fought Spain and France and other European countries over and over and over again. And just imagine how many ships had to be built to fight those battles over hundreds hundreds of years. A lot of them ended up at the bottom of the ocean. And one of the most famous battles involving England in the 1500s was the Battle of the Spanish Armada. England had over 200 ships, and Spain had just over 100 ships. Think about all the wood that had to be used in the making of each of those ships. We're talking over 300 ships in this one battle. Massive, massive galleons and men of war. So England completely obliterated Spain in the battle and earned its reputation as a big bad force, not to be messed with lightly. And this was just 15 years before King James I began his reign over England. And James is really where our story begins. So, okay, let's look at the forest again. In 1603, when James I sat on the English throne for the first time, the forests of England covered only 8% of the land, and 100 years ago it had been 9%. So, 1% change in 100 years maybe isn't that much, but again, they're an island. They don't have this huge supply of wood everywhere. It's not that much. But at least he had inherited this epic legacy where England destroyed the Spanish in this glorious high seas battle. But not really. That legacy didn't really mean much by the time James sat on the throne, because even though they were super, super cool for winning that battle, England was flat broke. I mean, like really, really broke. It had involved itself in way too many wars, and all of that fighting had cost money that Queen Elizabeth did not have. She had to borrow it from other people to pay her soldiers and the costs of war. So James inherited the shiny English throne and Queen Elizabeth's debt, which was about $119 million in today's money, or 109 million pounds in today's money. That debt was now his. And England did have some of its own supplies that it got from its soil and its earth and its animals, but it often had to go to other countries, like I had mentioned before. It had to go to other countries for things like spices, sugar, gunpowder, silk, wine, dyes, and types of food that did not grow in England. When it went to places like Norway and Sweden, sailors had to cross the infamous, very bad, no good North Sea. They had to cross the North Sea. It was horrible. Because if you haven't seen videos of ships in the North Sea, even today, with all the technology and strong metal that we have, it's still considered one of the most dangerous places in the world. And I definitely recommend checking out the videos because it is freaking nuts. But these guys were in like wooden ships, and they had to cross this sea to get some of these materials for their population. So every man who entered that sea was risking his life. He was putting his life in danger for this small reward of materials that he could bring back home. And they didn't go just once or twice. It was constant. It was a constant need to go out to these dangerous places for materials. And when they went up in the north, there were icebergs when they went on their way towards the Russian side. So that was kind of crazy and dangerous too. So they, unfortunately, even though there were men that were willing to risk their lives to bring home these materials for the English people, things like the King of Denmark, who ruled the entrance to those northern waters, could just stop English ships from coming in. He could just be like, you know what, I'm just going to stop these ships. I don't want them coming in anymore. And if England still tried to get past that area that the King of Denmark controlled, the King of Denmark would sink pirates on them or warships on them, which was also, as you can imagine, pretty dangerous. So, throughout the 1500s and the 1600s, England was at war on and off with different countries, and if their ships traveled anywhere in enemy territory, they risked the same capture or death. So, lots of danger getting basic materials for the people of England. And, like I was saying, England was constantly at war with France. Like, in particular, was far less dangerous than capture or death. But it was something that has been known to cause wars and revolutions all by itself. I am talking, of course, about taxes. At one point, France started taxing items that England brought into France to sell. Other areas of Europe had their own wars and unrest that made it hard to trade in those places as well. But we're talking pirates, icebergs if you go into the Russian territory, crazy dangerous waters in the north, the King of Denmark sicking pirates and warships on you if he decided that he didn't want you crossing there anymore. Rebellions and revolutions anywhere that you stop to sell or get materials from. And on top of that, taxes. People that ruled over areas that you were trying to get materials from or sell materials to could just like start taxing you, which is one of the benefits of having a colony for England, was that it could avoid all of these things, and taxes and pirates, and I mean not really pirates, but America, the American government wouldn't send out pirates to capture them until the American Revolution, when people were commissioned by the US Congress to act as pirates and stop the English ships. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so England needed all these things from other places, and it was basically at the mercy of whether war was on or was off, or are these guys stable over here? Are people starving and desperate over there? Is there an uprising when I'm gonna land? Who knows what's going on? And okay, so now that's England's supply issues. Let's hop into England itself and zoom down to the everyday life of the people. England's population around this time had increased dramatically, very dramatically, drastic increase from the mid-1500s to the year 1600, like 50 years or so, which is like maybe 2 or 3 generations. So if you think about from your grandparents to you, that's not really a long time. And in those 50 years, the population had gone from around 2 million to around 4 million, just within your grandparents' generation to you. That's a doubling in the population. That's crazy. It would be like if today's US population went from 350 million to 700 million in your grandchildren's lifetime. Or if the UK population went from 68 million to 136 million. Or if the entirety of the European population went from 742 million to 1.5 billion in those 2 generations. That is freaking nuts. That's crazy. So think about really what that would feel like living with that. And this really, it's an enormous amount of mouths to feed, an increase in mouths to feed, people to house, people who would commit crime and competition for the small amount of available jobs and materials. And on top of that, not only did you have to compete against a ton more people now, you also had the amount of available jobs was getting smaller and smaller, like I was saying. I mean, I kind of already said that, but think of it like this. You know, like wool, the hair from sheep. Basically, wool was used to make clothes, blankets, drapes, and other cloth material, and it was one of England's greatest sources of income was wool, and people all over the world paid to have England's wool shipped to them, and England didn't even have to clean it or weave it into a shirt or anything. People just bought the wool from them raw, and then those people in other countries would turn it into clothing and then sell that. So that also meant that England then had to turn around and buy these shirts and blankets and drapes and whatever else had been cleaned and woven from that wool. They had to turn around and buy it back into England. So England had millions of sheep, an endless supply of all of this wool. And you think, like, no problem, we'll just keep selling wool to everybody in the world, right? Like, you need wool. Nobody's gonna stop needing wool, right? Well, if you want to make something that people are guaranteed to buy, you just go ahead and get yourself some sheep and some land, and you'll be like rolling in gold and coins. Sheep farming was a really, really, really good job if you could get it. Not only did you sell their wool, but they also produced milk and meat that you could sell. Sounds great, super fantastic. What's wrong with everybody just handing over sheep bits for money? Well, for one thing, sheep require a raised sheep, the more land that was taken for the raising of those sheep. And the more sheep on the more land for said raising of sheep made it so that there was less land for the farming of food. And basically, it's taking up all this land. Now there's less land that can produce food. And basically, the population growing meant more sheep farmers and more land being used for sheep, and more land that was also being used for housing instead of growing food. And some of the food that did grow, if you were a sheep farmer, was used to feed the sheep instead of people. Okay, so it's not really a good idea if everybody becomes a sheep farmer. That's not really so good. So on top of that, if you're like me, when you think of a sheep farmer or a sheep herder, you think of this lonely man in his robes, and he's got a staff, and he's on a hill overlooking his flock of sheep. And that's because sheep farming was not like regular farming. With regular farming, you used a lot of people to break up the land and plant the seeds and cut the food and everything else that needs doing to grow food. Sheep farming is like one or two people for the entire thing. And so really there's less jobs. There's more land being taken up for sheep farming, less land available for food, less jobs for people on this land. And that's just one of the ways that the world was changing in England and making jobs very, very difficult to find. So the population was growing and the amount of available food was not growing with it. That's the important part. The important part was population was that doubled in size, and the available food did not double with it. So not only does that mean people will starve, it also means that the available food is going to cost a lot more. A gallon of milk might cost a penny for your grandparents, but now it costs 10 pennies. So, okay, now you can only afford 1 gallon of milk a week, and those prices are going up, but your wages were not increasing with the cost of things, kind of very similar to today. That gallon of milk costs 10 times as much as it used to, and you're getting paid the same wage. I know we can all relate. And maybe you're getting a slightly higher wage, maybe, but it's not 10 times what you used to make. Just like everything costs 10 times as much, you're not making 10 times as much the money. So you have a growing population and less available food, and the food that is available is very expensive. I'm just saying this stuff over and over again because I'm just really trying to paint a picture here. Where, okay, so you take that situation and you just like really crank it up a notch, and the larger population also means that more people are roaming around looking for work, which means that employers could hire whoever was willing to work for the lowest pay. So now, when you do offer your services, you're getting paid probably less than you used to make, not more, and probably not the same. So, I mean, it might have been the same for some people, but it was really, really competitive. So that apartment you wanted to rent for you and your family, it now costs 4 times what it used to. And so you can forget about that. Add to that 4 years of heavy rains and bad farming seasons, and you've got a super duper recipe for disaster. So the population had been growing so rapidly from the mid-1500s that Parliament actually started passing laws to deal with the issue of the poor and wandering homeless. It was thought, even back then, that local areas in your town or your village were responsible for the care of everyone who lived there. It was in the best interest of you and your family if the poor had food and shelter. This meant that it was less likely that someone would rob you while you were walking around at night. And this idea has stuck around for centuries and still kind of applies today. We can see a lot of our current ideas about social welfare coming from the laws of medieval England. The Poor Act, as it was called, authorized representatives of the government to go around knocking door to door in each town and village and gently asking for donations for the poor who lived in the area. And I say gently asking with a hint of sarcasm, because the truth is, if a person refused to make a donation to the poor in the area, that person would be summoned to a meeting where very important people from the local church would persuade them to make the donation. Sometimes even this persuasion from very important people didn't work, and the poor old government collectors had to go back to their superiors with their tails between their legs, saying, "We didn't collect any money from these people. Even super important people can't convince them to give up money for the poor." So this dragged out for a really long time, and it lasted for about 11 years, this way of trying to persuade people to give money to the poor. But then in 1562, Parliament passed another law designed to help the poor. This one sort of kept the earlier poor law alive. But then in 1562, Parliament signed another law designed to help the poor. This one kind of kept the earlier poor law alive and added to it that people refusing to make a payment to the poor could be brought before an actual legal judge. And if you held firm and still refused to make a donation to the poor, you could be imprisoned until you changed your mind and handed over some of your money. Keep in mind, this is still while the basic cost of food and other necessary items for daily living was rising, and wages were being paid to those who would work for the least amount of pay. This may seem cruel and medieval, but it's literally the same way that we do taxes today. If you really think about it, you have to pay for the social welfare of the people, and if you don't, you could get thrown in jail. It's basically the same. You have to pay your taxes. And eventually, each town and village was required to register the names of those who were too old or not able-bodied enough to work. Then they would figure out how much each of those people on the list would cost to take care of for the whole year. Then they would divide that number by the amount of people who lived in the area, and that was the amount each person would pay in donations for the poor each year. So fast forward a little bit. By 1601, a law was in place that made it so that the local areas had to provide tools and materials to those who could work, and everybody else who could work and refused to work was actually just sent to prison, which is kind of crazy. And begging was specifically illegal. You could get into a lot of trouble for begging, where sometimes there were too many elderly or too many disabled people in an area, and the king would issue special licenses to beg. And sometimes this was for the elderly, sometimes it was for the disabled, and sometimes they gave them out to people when there were just too many to feed from the welfare taxes. This license to beg came with a fancy metal badge that people took with them wherever they went. They could show it to an authority, and it let them know that the person had the king's permission to beg. But if you were caught begging without one of these licenses, your punishment could include being whipped, having a hole burned through your ear, being branded, or in rare cases, enslavement for a number of years. If that weren't bad enough and you continued to beg without a license, your next appointment might be at the gallows. If those are my choices, I'll work for next to nothing and be okay with that. Thank you very much. And it's safe to say that the number of poor and unemployed people in the 1500s and 1600s was a massive problem. And we haven't even gotten to the worst part of all of this, if you can imagine that. Crime. Crime was definitely something that we need to talk about. A growing population, and large parts of that growing population being very, very poor, and a large part of that poor being sick and desperate, a rise in crime was going to happen. Crime by the start of the 1600s was rampant. It was everywhere. Some estimates put the crime rate at 10 times higher than it is today. It's really easy to just breeze past that for a second, but really think about that. Every crime you see committed on Nextdoor or YouTube or crime statistics today, turn that number into 10. And for every 100 crimes, that's 1,000 crimes. For every robber you see in videos, that's 10 robbers. For every murder, 10 murders. Just really multiply all of those things in your head and think about all of these problems that are going around and what it might have felt like to be living in that time. It must have really felt like the world was coming to an end. So what's to be done? What should 100 years. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and spices came back. Tales of vast, untouched forests filled the minds of people who were faced with the shrinking forests of England. The New World was a bright possibility in the minds of the people, especially for those who could lose everything if England ran out of wood, or if a king randomly started a war and they couldn't get what they needed from other parts of the world anymore. France, Spain, and other rival powers were already taking up land in the New World. England must have thought to itself, why should England sit on the sidelines when there are endless unoccupied lands there for the taking? It would solve all of our problems of being at the mercy of enemy countries, of running out of wood, of not having our own soil to grow enough food. It would even help stop some of our enemies from gaining some of that unoccupied land and becoming more powerful. Why shouldn't we reach out and take it? Well, the problem, of course, obviously, the land was not unoccupied. Natives and the Americans have been living there for thousands of years, warring and killing and conquering and building their own civilizations. And England and the rest of the world was very well aware of this. But to them, vast forests with no roads, buildings, or towns was something the natives and the Europeans couldn't resist but take if they felt they were stronger than those that already lived there. And this isn't a justification of genocide and brutality that the natives suffered. This is to try and get into the minds of the people who came over to England. Why did they do that? What was in it for them? What was in their minds? It was out of a sense of personal desperation and survival of the country that English colonists immigrated to the Americas and set up the first permanent English colony in 1607. War with the natives and atrocities would come later. But for now, this first permanent settlement was Jamestown, and it was named after the King of England, James. And there also was a sense of adventure that had built up in Europe. It was the age of discovery and exploration. But the main reason that immigrants to Jamestown first came over was the hope of producing wood, iron, and gold for themselves and for England. Loads of country-saving wealth should be pouring in at any moment, ready to shine a light on the bleak existence England was falling into. Well, such hopes and dreams were met